Hi listener, just before we get into this month's episode, I'd like to give you a quick content warning. Both the short story Final Reward and our discussion of it do mention suicide. We don't go into a lot of detail and it's not a big part of the story, but we do talk about it. So go easy.
Whether you're an actor or a writer or a singer.
Or a podcaster.
Well, yes, I can tell by your tormented faces that your life is but dust and ashes, and the only happiness is bringing the word of Terry Pratchett to the world.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Lux.
I'm Ben McKenzie.
Welcome to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast.
Each month we discuss one of Terry Pratchett's books or short stories with a special guest.
This month we're reading Final Reward, or All Good Doggers Go to Kevin.
Oh no. And our I was not ready for that. And our returning guest is writer Penelope Love. Welcome, Penny.
Hi, hello to you both. I don't know that I was ready for that either.
No, who could be?
I'm so sorry to have done that to you.
But how delightful to have you back on the show. It's been about a year. What have you been up to since we saw you last?
Well, you know, this and that. We've been not doing a lot of writing, but as we've all been through COVID and the things beyond, we've all been trying to get by, and I think we've all been escaping into a lot of fun fiction as opposed to grim fiction. I've certainly gone back to my treasure trove of Edwardian children's fiction where saintly golden-haired children redeem the adults around them, and nothing will beat that kind of thing. The Pollyanna, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. I forget the name of one where the saintly child plays a violin and redeems the crusty old farmer. So I can recommend that if people are looking for some escapism.
Is that the main variation, what talents the golden-haired children have?
Yes, and generally about chapter 15 or 16 they have a life-threatening disease. But recover, generally, you know, thanks to the love of those around them.
Transformed by their experience, no doubt, in some way.
That's right. Little Lord Fauntleroy. Little Lord Fauntleroy is the place to start.
Do you know, I'm not sure I've ever read it.
Oh, look.
I certainly haven't.
It's available on Gutenberg Press, everybody. And A Secret Garden, you may have read.
Oh, yes.
And because this is all fiction I think Terry Pratchett would have been familiar with, because every now and then you see some tropes of that appear in his work. But
Yes. Yes, I think so. The children's fiction that I think he most touches on, there's a bit of Just William in some of his writing and a bit of Tom Brown's School Days. There's a quite deliberate parody of that a couple of times.
That's right.
So there's some of those things.
I do love Just William.
And George MacDonald Fraser, of course, wrote the Flashman series, which takes the bully from Tom Brown's School Days and makes him the hero.
Huh. I like the Karate Kid.
Though anti-hero is perhaps the word I would use. I know Flashman runs quivering through every single battle in the mid-Victorian period and somehow manages to cheat his way to victory pretty much every time. And
Did he survive for like some phenomenally long time? Like he gets all the way into like the late 20th century, or maybe not the late 20th century, but the mid 20th century at some point.
And George MacDonald Fraser, in fact, could be a bit of a model for Dogger because he's got that very much that slightly cynical attitude that I think Dogger. Sorry, we haven't got to talking about the story yet. I should.
No, but that's all right. It's good.
Everything is the story.
We're already thinking about it, so I think we should get into it because we are here to discuss Final Reward, which is a story Pratchett wrote, which was first published in 1988. And before we get onto the story, let's start the way we do with our short story episodes and read Pratchett's notes from the collection A Blink of the Screen. I've tinkered with it since, and I can see it needs further tinkering. Once or twice I've thought about extending it into a novel, and then thought better of it. But I've always had a soft spot for this story. That's it. That's all he wrote. He didn't have much to say about it apart from, I like this one, and I've fiddled with it. It was first published in a magazine I hadn't heard of until now, which is weird because I am a little bit of a student of, sort of the history of role-playing. But it was first published in a magazine called GM, the Independent Fantasy Role-Playing Magazine. And as I found out when I researched this, in its second ever issue is where this story appeared. So I think Pratchett clearly was into the subject matter. He must have known the editorial team somehow, I think, for them to get in touch with him and get him in their second issue ever. Yeah, big get. And he did come back to the magazine. This was the other fun thing I found out. He also had a little contribution in their 11th issue where someone else wrote a whole scenario for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons set in the Discworld. And then he wrote a page worth of response to what they'd written, which when I read it was slightly disappointing because it was mostly gags from Discworld books. Like it wasn't mostly original stuff, although there's one or two little things in there, but he thought it was quite good. And there is a map of Ankh-Morpork in that scenario. And Pratchett mentions at the time that's the first map of Ankh-Morpork he's ever seen. And it does predate the officially published one by about 4 years. So that was quite interesting. So clearly he had a bit of an in with these folks and had a bit of fun writing this story, which is the kind of thing you probably expect to see published in a role-playing game magazine, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's very post-deconstructionalist, isn't it? It's all about what happens when a fantasy character appears in your life. It addresses that very deep anxiety I think writers have that their character would be more popular and a better person than they are.
Yes. Absolutely.
So, yes, when Erdan comes back into the real world, you get the feeling he's going to cope with it better than Dogger has.
We meet Dogger first, who's the main character of this story, it took me a while. I had to read it twice until I realized he does get a first name. Kevin Dogger. It's not the sort of name you often see on a front cover of a novel, is it?
No, but I mean, I had a lot of fun having a look at these names, being like, are they anagrams? Are they things? And all I could come up with for Dogger is that backwards it is reg god, like regular god. So I thought maybe that's deliberate considering the context in which he is in this story, because he's just like a regular guy, but to this guy, he's like God. He's the maker. He's the creator. So I feel like that's not a coincidence, or maybe it is. And then I quite enjoyed that Erdan, his creation, basically it's danger with missing a G and flipped around. But Dogger has 2 G's, so he's got like 1 to spare. So that kind of, to me, I was like, is that about their connection to one another? And it's a danger if they come together, and that's why they must, spoilers, not ever exist too long in the same world. But maybe I'm getting too English essay about this, and maybe I'm having too much of a crossword attitude, but I spent a little bit too long on their names.
I mean, I'm enjoying this. I feel like I'm on an episode of Letters and Numbers right now.
Well, the joke that dog is God backwards is actually a very old one, so it could be right. And Dogger is also very similar to Danger, so they could both have names for variants of Danger, as of somebody desperately trying to think of 2 very stupid names for his characters.
It's true. All right, well, you're in agreement, the two of you.
But together they create danger.
Yes.
Because they are like parts of a whole.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? But I mean, this story kind of gets right into it because the first thing that happens is Dogger is saying, I must have gone mad. This can't be right. And then he starts thinking about the night before when he's had an argument with his girlfriend, Nikki. I don't know how much
break up.
Dissecting this relationship, but clearly they have nothing in common and they shouldn't be together. Like, it's nonsense. And he's got nothing but disrespect for all her friends and the things that she thinks are important, you know? She's got all these sort of hippie and alternate lifestyle friends, clearly, who are vegetarians and so on. And he's just making jokes about women wearing dungarees and how anti-nuclear stickers are not useful in any way. And you're like, I don't like you. I do not like you, Kevin Dogger. This story does have a footnote, which was fun, considering it's so short. Yeah. About Yen Buddhists, which is like a Zen Buddhist, but with a bigger begging bowl. I don't know that Zen Buddhists do have begging bowls, but it is a funny play on words. But yes, it's morning. He's gotten up, presumably to go and get the newspaper and maybe the
7 a.m. Pretty early.
It's early, but well, I mean, look, Erdan the Barbarian is not going to knock on your door at like a respectable time. He's going to get in as soon as the sun comes up, right? But yes, he's opened the door, and standing on his doorstep is the main character from his books. I mean, look, there's a pretty thin plot, so I think we can get the plot out of the way pretty quickly and then talk about the specific parts of the writing. But this character turns up on his doorstep. It's Erdan the Barbarian, because after he's had this argument with his girlfriend, Nikki, she has derided his stories, talking about the fact that he's written this sort of male, stereotypical male power fantasy of this big, powerful barbarian, and it's gross and might as well be a Rambo movie. And he's come home and, like, in a fit of pique gone, all right, I'll show you, and killed him off at the end of the book he was just finishing. And now he's turned up to meet his maker, as he says, which he has.
Along with his sword.
Oh, yes, Skung, the sword of the ice gods, yes. Another sword that must have taken hours of thought before he came up with the name.
And he's described it so many times, but not one more time. Not for this one.
There's a really sort of genre of Pratchett sword names. Like the other talking sword that appears in the Discord novels is called Kring.
Okay.
And it's got a very different attitude to Skung. Skung's a bit more traditional.
Elric and Stormbreaker.
Stormbreaker, yeah. He's very like,
yes.
I will kill people and drink their blood in order to fuel your power, and yeah.
But he's real, like, I am Groot about it.
Yes.
Like, he just has the same phrase, but he says it in different ways.
Yes, I want to drink his blood too, said Skung. He's just getting on with his day.
Yeah.
He says it conversationally.
Yes. Well, what I like in a way with Erdan is that when he turns up, he's not really here, but then he slowly comes into existence. So it's as though by the effort of trying to kill him, the author's attempt to kill his creation has actually made it more real by drawing him into his world. Yeah, he was standing patiently next to the milk. There you go. Good way to start.
Yeah, and then they describe the milk, and then they describe him, and that is lovely.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And at first he's sort of like, oh, maybe it's someone cosplaying, but then, although he doesn't use that word because it wasn't really coined, I don't know, in 1988. But, he thinks he's a fan who's dressed up, but then he realized, no, this guy's for real. He's too big. He's too authentic.
So we invited him in, which doesn't seem like a great idea, but I mean, what else would you do in that scenario?
Yeah. I mean, because he's not threatening him or anything. He just says, I've come to meet my maker, and he lets him in. And then he says, I'm here for my final reward. And you're like, what? What does that mean?
It is said that those who die in combat will feast and carouse in your hall forever. Oh, my hall?
Yeah.
What with the telephone and coat rack, it was already pretty crowded.
Yeah. Maybe you should come into the main, the lounge room instead.
He can carouse our house of tofu. It's okay.
That's right. But it's the juxtaposition between the reality of the barbarian warriors, Conan-like figure striding the ice plains and your actual semi-detached scene. Where is it? Is it in London? I forget.
Yeah, I think he mentions the northern line, so I think he's on, sort of the northern outskirts of London.
Mind you, if you're the author of a best-selling series of fantasy novels, I think there's about 17, weren't there? I think it was mentioned. Why are you not living in a slightly bigger house?
Yeah.
He's got lots of money. He says that early on as well, so.
Yeah, it hasn't made him happy, though.
What's his agent doing?
Yeah, what's going on here? I mean, this might be Pratchett's own experience coming to the fore, because at this point in 1988, he's made some money, but he's not yet, wealthy off the back of Discworld. I think it's working out for him. It's a job, because the next year the thing that he contributes alongside the role-playing scenario in that later issue of this same magazine is an extract from Pyramids before it comes out. So this is still fairly early on, but he's doing all right. But maybe he's not rich. Like, he's got a house, he can pay the bills, but he's not a rich man yet. But he's working on it. He's getting there. He's already famous. And maybe that's Dogger's experience. He's sold 17 of these books, but they're not, it's enough to keep things going, but he's not making $1 million off each one. And I mean, look, I've never published a book. I don't know what kind of money you expect to make on one that does well.
Well, but also you get the feeling he's actually a bit sick of the character, which is why he decides to kill him off. Also, in a way, you kind of feel... I'm sorry, I've forgotten his girlfriend's name.
Oh, Nikki.
Nikki. You kind of do feel Nikki... You could just see her. She's this lovely girl who's a bit sorry for him. I don't know. But she's getting sick of his...
Yeah.
Whenever he gets a few drinks in him, he does start mouthing off about women who don't shave their legs or something, and
Oh, yeah.
He did say pint of wine, which was an amazing phrase.
Yeah. He kind of, the one kind of slightly redeeming thing he says, which it doesn't really redeem him, but he does say at one point that he starts speaking in defense of people that he realizes when he's sober, he probably wouldn't like any more than she does. And you're like, okay, you are, but that's, in some ways that's worse. Like he doesn't really believe all these things, but he feels like he has to take an anti-position because for whatever reason, I don't know. Who knows?
Just to play devil's advocate.
There's a lot of toxic masculinity going on in Kevin Dogger, I think.
Yes, but that's why it's coming out in Erdan. I mean, the problem is when Erdan turns up, he's actually rapidly evolving, as the rest of this conversation is going to show, into something else.
Yeah. And I really liked there's sort of a line that sets that up, which doesn't happen until a bit later, because the first things that happen is he just starts becoming a bit more solid. They go shopping together.
That's right.
Where he's like, yeah, I've got all the things I want. I've got some meat. I've got a thing. I found a woman and I put her in the, and you're like, okay, that's not okay.
Hi, my name is Tracy. How may I help you?
Yeah.
And she has the pricing gun, and she like labels his nose 98p.
That was pretty funny. So he's clearly able to affect the world around him, but he's still invisible to most people.
TARDIS.
Yeah. And Dogger tries talking to someone. He tries talking to his agent or his publisher about this, or his editor. I can't remember
it's his
who it
agent.
was, but
Yeah.
his agent. Yeah.
Yes.
And the agent's like, look, just take a break, mate. Like, it's the strain. Yeah.
Breaking some tablets.
When they come back home, though, from the shopping, he sort of starts domesticating Erdan, teaching him what soap is, using references from the books to explain things. Because, he is kind of like his god. He knows everything that Erdan's done. So he kind of uses that as a reference to try and make that work.
Well, that Neighbours line hits different now that Neighbours is cancelled, though. It's like, this is soap, not like Neighbours.
Oh.
Like, this one is useful. I'm like, ooh.
That's right. That's just
yeah,
cruel.
that's rough.
Forever.
Yes. I was just going to say, you remember when I put you in the Seraglio of the Emir of the White Mountain? I'm pretty certain you had a wash and a shave then. So this is just like then.
Like that. But then he's like, well, where are all the concubines or whatever? He's like, no, it's not like that.
Oh, the Houris. Even better, the Houris.
Oh, yeah. Well, now, this is a word I've heard, but I don't, what does that mean?
It's
The virginal maidens, specifically from Muslim culture, I think.
the ones who will wait upon you in paradise. But in this context, yes, I think sexy young ladies wearing not a lot who are clearly going to wash and shave you in the fancy land, but alas, not in the bedsit. Sorry, the semi-detached.
In the lavatory. Too small to have a bath in.
That's right.
Yeah, it does sound exactly like the sort of thing Dogger would write about. Yes. Even at this point, though, when he's sort of, becoming a bit more used to living in the real world, and he's seeing it through this lens of, oh, this is great. And he's like amazed by the refrigerator. He's like, you've captured winter in a box. This is incredible. I thought that was great. So he's quite happy, even though it's not what he expected. Yeah. It's still pretty great. It's better than having to, schlep around on the tundra.
That's right. Go out and hunt the mammoth yourself. I think the other thing is actually the real emotional relationship in this book, in this story, is, of course, between the writer and his creation and how that changes. And he's absolutely being the guy, Erdan's dad. Dogger does just step in and say, oh, gosh, I'm going to see you need a bit of help in the world. And eventually he kind of realizes the final step he needs to take, which we will get to in a bit. And so I think in a way he's being very self-sacrificing as you do. What we do as writers is you start writing. I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this as well. You start writing, and if you do it well, though, the writer that you eventually just running after the character, writing down what they're saying, and so this is just a literal embodiment of that,
Yeah, definitely. I do like along the way too, as he refers to the various books, in order to sort of make reference to things that Erdan will understand. We get the titles of some of them,
yes.
Which makes them sound like they're sort of, maybe they're a little bit Discworldy, like, because there's Erdan and the Serpent of the Rim, indicating maybe he lives on a flat world. There's several in there. Erdan and the Top of the World. Like, they're kind of does what it says on the tin sort of fantasy titles, aren't they? It's got this guy in it, and this is what he's doing. He's fighting a serpent. He's going north.
It's all you need to know.
Yeah.
Tarzan and the this, that, and the other,
Although I will note, Top of the World and Serpent of the Rim don't seem to entirely agree, because one of them suggests a flat world. One of them suggests maybe a globe. I don't know. Unless he's going to the top of a
maybe
mountain.
just a big mountain on a disc.
Yeah. Like on the Discworld again.
Yeah, but the whole thing is a mountain. Big round mountain with a rim and a peak. I don't know how geography works.
Who does? I mean, once it's a fantasy world, all bets are off. But yeah, they get to a point where, and I think, it's not entirely clear how much time passes, but it's not long. Like, it's maybe a couple of days at most.
They get to the house of tofu. They come back again.
Yeah, that's about it, really. I mean, there's kind of a day in between.
But in that time, he also does say, Erdan is how I cope with the world. I just never realised it myself. Whereas Nikki did realise it. And that is a way. If you actually can't deal with the world, retreating behind a typewriter and creating a macho character who can, it's not an effective way of dealing with the real world, but it'll get you by.
Yeah. And and as they're going to go to the House of Tofu, he's like, well, you can't wear a loincloth outside.
Why not?
So I'm going to try and get you some clothes. You're not going to fit into any of my clothes because you're massive. So instead, what I'll do is I'll write you a new set of clothes. And this is where he sort of realizes the magic, whatever it is still kind of working. Right. So he writes him, oh yeah, he's in a suit. It's not clear where he put the suit. Like, where did he edit that into the book, or did he just write a passage on its own? I'm not.
There's like a store under the avalanche that he goes into.
He just found it there.
I think he's writing it, because that's what he says about that's just the blinking cursor. The black screen, because when he was writing in 1988, it was a bit a black or a blue screen. You wouldn't do it on the monitor. And then there was light. It's the words you type. You are the God that creates the world. And there's that point where he wants, oh, silly me, a big lad like you wouldn't have died in the avalanche, he says, pulling the manuscript towards him. I'll just write you back in, at which point Erdan just goes, a hand like iron closed over his wrist. Gently but firmly. And Erdan does not want to be written back into that world. He likes it here. He's going to stay.
Yeah. I quite liked that, because he's aware of what, even if he doesn't understand at that point all of the mechanics of what's happened, he gets that, this could happen possibly. Yes. And as they're on their way to the House of Tofu, terrible name for a restaurant. Well, maybe not. I mean, I would go to a House of Tofu. I'm a vegetarian. It would suit me.
Delicious.
Who is tofu?
Sorry. And of course, Skung is being made to be left behind because Skung was a sort of few words, and none of them would go down well in a whole food restaurant.
They sort of leave him behind the sofa, which is,
I think he's probably still there now.
Yeah. I was wondering where he ended up.
Is that the last we see of him? We'll have to find out.
I think
we'll find out. But yeah, as they're on the way, he's like slowly evolved. Like, his suit becomes proper. He kind of assumes still large, but more normal large human proportions rather than outlandish. And his hair kind of assembles itself. I think there's a reference to that. And Dog kind of realizes, he's kind of fitting in. And there's this sort of nice line where he says, this is how it works with heroes. You put them in any situation and they adapt to fit in, which is something he realizes he himself is not capable of, or at least doesn't feel capable of. And he also realizes there's no going back now. He's here. He belongs here. And you know what? We're going to go in there. And it's sort of like, I like how in a lot of fantasy stories that are set in the real world, where there's this sort of magical realism or urban fantasy, there's often a really long sort of, in hero's journey terms, denial of the call. Like, there's often a very long period where the protagonist just refuses to believe the magic is happening or that the magic is real. And that always annoys me, because I'm like, I know what kind of book I'm reading. Can the main character get on board, please?
Yes.
But that doesn't happen here. Like, there's a little bit of resistance, and then Dog is like, okay. And then not only does he realize what's happening, he sees the writing on the wall. He's the one who realizes where it's going. And I quite liked that about this.
Because you're a writer, you were always going to see the writing on the wall, because that's words. Words is your thing. Words is the creation. Words is the tool.
Yeah, and you'd hope that a fantasy writer would have the imagination to see how this was going to work out as well, wouldn't you?
That's right.
And it seems that he does, because he can kind of see what's going to happen is we're going to go in here, we're going to sit down with Nikki, you and her are going to hit it off. I don't think I want to be there for that. And also, I've had an idea. So he just says, look, here's the key to my house in case you need it. I'm going home, or I've got to go and do something. I'll see you later. He doesn't say he's going home, and he leaves. And sure enough, he's right. But there's there's also a nice nod that like Erdan is becoming enmeshed in our world, because as he leaves, he says, "Don't worry, I won't send you back to Shimra," which is the name of the place he's from, which is kind of a nice like nod to Conan, who's from Cimmeria, and also, you know, classical mythology. But but Erdan just says Shimra with a bit of a hint of amusement, indicating he's now thinking that's not a real place.
That's right. Oh, also, if you're going to send me back, can I take the television back with me? You know, no.
Yeah, that's right.
It gets lonely on the endless taiga between books, you know.
Oh, yeah. Which is, now that's interesting too, because there he's aware that, okay, there are books, and in between I just sit around doing nothing. Like, it's terrible. I'd like something to occupy me, please. But yeah, Dogger goes home and he starts writing something on the word processor, although at this point we don't know what. But he gets right into it and he writes something, and the ideas begin to crystallize, is the phrase from the story. And then sometime later, as we get to the end, Erdan and Nikki come back to Dogger's house together, and she's like, "Oh, look, this is typical him. He's just not got his shit together." And he doesn't seem to be there. And Erdan immediately, as he comes in, sees there's a printout, a fresh thing on the printer. He's looking at it going, and he just picks up a pencil, starts editing the writing that's there. And while it is never said, and I like how it's, you know, Pratchett's just like, you know what's happened, I don't need to tell you, but it's clear that Kevin has written himself into the world of his fantasy books. And Erdan is now giving it a slight edit, tightening it up, thinking about things he might need.
I love that. He's just gone out into the prairie without a coat. I will give him a warm, furry coat. He'll freeze to death.
Yeah. He's like, "Oh yeah, I'll put these guys, what do they call the Skrylings or something in there? They're all right. I've hung out with them before."
And they like mad people. Tap, tap, tap. But I just want, the key there, I think, is the word processor kicked into life. The monitor was out form, and void and darkness was upon the screen, with, of course, the exception of the beckoning flicker of the cursor, which is the title of the collection. And that, of course, is a little take on the start of the Bible. So, you know, the word was God, and the darkness, and then God spoke, and there was light. So it's that creation moment. And also, it's for me, I thought that very amusing, because that's the horror of the blank page, you know, that writers have when you've got to fill it.
Yeah. We talk about that in the workshops we do with kids as we're getting them to write on paper. And one of the solutions we give them is just do a scribble in the corner. Now it's not blank, it's just scrap paper. You can do whatever you want on it now. There's no computer equivalent really of that.
You've just got to start writing, people. It's going to be crap, but that's okay. You'll just get there. But it's really hard. As
Pratchett himself said, and this quote has been doing the rounds a little bit recently, the first draft is just you telling yourself the story, which I thought was quite good advice.
Right. Who was, I don't think it was Ernest Hemingway, it was some modern American writer. Writing is quite easy, all you just get out the typewriter and bleed.
That's interesting, because that's how Pratchett talks about short stories. He says in the introduction to many of the stories in this book that they cost him blood. Like he finds it much easier to write a novel than something really short.
Because when you're trying to write jokes, you often have to write long to build up the in-joke, which then becomes funnier and funnier each time. So actually writing stuff funny, short funny, is very hard. And Terry Pratchett, again, is going back to people like P.G. Wodehouse, who said the same thing. P.G. Wodehouse said it's really hard to make writing look so effortless. You've got to get onto that plane of the relentlessly silly but amiable, which I think both Terry Pratchett and P.G. Wodehouse inhabit. And P.G. Wodehouse, he wrote a very good biography called Performing Flea, which probably talked about how he felt about his writing career. But sometimes he would write 30 or 40,000 words and then just throw it away because it was wrong. And I'm sure Terry Pratchett had probably had a lot of stuff in his rubbish basket that we'd quite like to go and have a look at now. But there you are.
Oh, yeah. But we can't, because he had it destroyed by a steamroller. That was in his will. I don't know if we've mentioned that in the podcast for a while, but in his will, his hard drives with all his unfinished stories were to be destroyed by an old-fashioned actual steam-powered steamroller. And they did it a few months after he died, and it was kind of amazing.
That's beautiful.
I love it. I'm sad for not being able to read it, but...
There's a reason why that stuff was left on the hard drive and was not taken out, and they just respect their wishes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Unlike Kafka, who told his best friend as he lay dying to burn all his stuff when he died, and the friend didn't know he published it. So, thank you. Oh. Now we have to read things like Metamorphosis and.
Sometimes it works out, like those unpublished manuscripts of Jules Verne's that like his great grandkids found in a safe at some point.
I don't think they did. I think somewhat like with Christopher Tolkien, who kept finding more and more stuff of Granddad's hidden in a vault in the attic. I think you pretend you find them and you've got somebody to write them yourself.
This is shattering a lot of my illusions here, Penny. I'm going to be investigating Paris in the 20th century. It's going to make me very sad, I feel.
No.
It's like, I was reading this Shirley Jackson collection recently, and I was like, why am I hating these when I normally love her stuff? And it turned out it was a bunch that had been collected posthumously that hadn't been polished up or finished and hadn't been published. And I was like, oh, this shouldn't have been published. And it's kind of crap that if I hadn't read the introduction that I wouldn't have known this. I'd have just thought this was a mediocre work by her that she was happy to send out in the world. So,
Yeah, well, this collection's interesting too, like a blink of the screen, because there's only one story in it that hadn't already been published somewhere else. So it's all stuff that had already seen the light of day. And the only one that hadn't until immediately before this book was published was The High Megas, which we talked about quite recently, which had just never been published until he picked up the idea again and turned it into some novels. So, yeah, there was some discussion about this because one of the last things that were published of Pratchett's were these collections of his very, very early children's stories from back when he was like 17 to 25, when he was writing them for a local newspaper. And they're a lot of fun, but he was a writer who really hung on to an idea that he liked and would reuse it or find a new way to recycle it into something better or bigger. And so some of those stories form the basis or clearly the origins of ideas that end up as novels, either in the Discworld series or outside of that. He was, though, happy for those to be republished and indeed tinkered with them a little bit in the first volume or two that were published before his death. Not quite sure if he'd done that with all of them. I'd have to look that up because there were a couple of them published after he died. But yeah, it's interesting that he would go back and look at that. And also how embarrassed he is of some of his early stuff. There's that introduction to one of his very early stories. I think the first thing he ever had published, which is the one about the advertising salesman who gets a job from the devil. And he's just in the introduction to it. He says, if I stick my fingers in my ears, I can't hear you reading this. And I'll just go, no. And you're like, okay, I get it.
There's Ramsey Campbell is a very well-known British horror writer, and there's a short story he wrote when he was still a teenager, which contains the immortal, which I thought of that when looking at the Terry Pratchett story. It contains the immortal line, and then the door burst open and the aforementioned skeleton rushed into the room.
Oh, wow.
I need that in a cross stitch, like really large on my wall.
We've all had it.
That's
and yet,
amazing.
Yeah, he went on to become a great writer, so...
Arguably that, I mean, I don't think I could write something that amazing if I wanted to.
Yes, it does sound like something you'd write now as an example of a fictional writer who's terrible. But look, let's get to the end of the story because I want to go back and look at some of the lines in it in a bit more detail. But the end of the story is that Nikki and Erdan are talking about what's maybe happened to Dogger. Where is he? Erdan's making these little edits. Nikki's like, oh, you write it too? And he sort of pauses and thinks about it for a second. And he's like, I'm just breaking into it. And she kind of admits that maybe she doesn't like Kevin that much, although that's not what she says, but it's clearly what she's saying, if you know what I mean.
Just break up.
I mean, I quite like Kevin. You know, she says, I quite like him. I think they're just moving into the relationship and she's feeling a bit embarrassed because it's a bit quick.
Yeah.
But they were already
in his
breaking
house.
up. Yeah, in his house. But they were already breaking up, you know.
Well, they should have been if they weren't. Yeah, I agree with you both. But this is where the story takes a bit of a turn because she's looking out the window and she's like, oh, there's a lot of blue lights down on the railway line. Clearly police cars and some sort of commotion and people milling about. And Erdan just sort of changes the name of the story. And then the last thing he edits in, I like this touch. He goes, he added book 1 in the Chronicles of Kevin the Bardsinger. Now, look, this ending, there was a question about this, but I think we're just going to talk about it here. I did not find this ambiguous. Like, it's clearly implying that Kevin felt in order for him to make the transition, he needed to die, just as Erdan needed to die to come into the real world. So he has written himself into this story and then gone and thrown himself in front of a train, which is kind of, like, awful, but seems to clearly be what is being implied here.
Yeah.
Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. That does seem to be what's being implied. And he dots the trains throughout the whole story, foreshadowing it. Like, he's like, don't try and fight a train. He talks about the noise of it throughout. So the trains are set up very clearly as a whole thing. Yeah, so I don't think that's supposed to be a little bit ambiguous because he doesn't straight up say it, because he just sort of leaves the clues there for you to figure it out. But it seems like it's not, I don't think there's an argument that that's not what happened.
I think he touches on it very lightly because it's not a very hilarious thing to put in what is otherwise a very light, funny novel. But he does, once you accept that you can write something into reality, and he does do that, he says, Chimera already existed in a little bubble of fractal reality created by these 10 fingers, which is lovely. It's that creation of the author for his world. So I think he just realises that I'm writing this, then perhaps even this world is almost being written by somebody else, you know. So if you can do that, but yes, because he had to kill off poor old Erdan in that avalanche for Erdan to turn up. So he's just, I think, decided to do the same thing. But we don't have to worry too much about that. The fact is the mechanism has happened and the swap has occurred. He's gone off to be Kevin the Bardsinger in another 27 books, as written by Erdan, who we can assume is going to probably change his name or to Ernest or something.
Yeah. I have to admit, while it is subtle, I did find it a bit jarring because I'm like, but this is still meant to be kind of a version of the real world. So there's a lot of things that I think about now that I think about that happening that I don't think about when a barbarian on a fantasy world dies in an avalanche. But also when a barbarian in a fantasy world dies in an avalanche, he's just gone. Like there's probably nobody comes across his body until 20 years later when he's, been eaten by things mostly. Whereas this is like, anyway, let's not dwell on it, but it just seemed a bit of a nasty end, and I was expecting something a bit gentler.
I think that's why he's saying he needs to fiddle with it a bit more. It's, and he said it still needs work, but at the same time, writing people in and out of worlds, I think, is a much better technique, and perhaps if he was going to work on it any further, he would do it that way. But it's also a very difficult conceit to carry, which is why it is done very seldom. I only know of one other thing where, and that's not even that, it's Stephen King, The Dark Half, who wrote a novel, but in that case it was more like when he started writing as Richard Bachman, and he eventually got outed. Some sharp-eyed librarian realised that all the dedications in Richard Bachman's book were people who Stephen King knew. And after that experience of having this alter ego, he wrote The Dark Half, which is about the guy takes on a pseudonym to write on I think it's exactly reflecting on that experience, a pseudonym to write on the novels, but that pseudonym person comes to life and he's a kind of a serial killer because Stephen King is a horror writer. But that's the only one I'm aware of where somebody's kind of taking that kind of fictive shift between reality and the fantasy. And then a few other things like, I think, Inkheart, but I haven't read Inkheart either. And I think it's because it's very difficult to maintain that degree of separation, especially looking at Edwardian fantasy novels, children's novels, terrible death rate in all of those. People's parents are being knocked off left, right and centre. Small children die in the snow. It's just awful. We would never, it'd be incredibly grim and tragic if it was in real life. We know it's not because it's a step away. And that's the jarring note in this story. I think that suddenly the death is real.
I thought there was quite a dark thread throughout the whole story, actually, because, Dogger is very unlikable, I think, and I don't think he likes himself, and that comes across quite clearly, like, even from the line that Ben pointed out. He's like, in the light of day, he wouldn't argue for these people that he doesn't actually like. He's picking fights with his girlfriend. He even tries to be a bit better to suit what he thinks she wants. Like, he starts taking the Guardian, but then he makes snide comments about that and all kinds of stuff. And towards the end, like, cause when he's walking towards, House of Tofu or Tofu's house or whatnot, he has that realization and says to Erdan, it's like, I'm just saying a chap has only got so much of it and I gave mine to you. And so then there was also that line about how Erdan is a hero and heroes adapt to their environment. So I was like, okay, so Erdan is heroic. But then at the end, I didn't quite understand why he'd be suddenly good at writing, like, because that doesn't fit into the traditional hero mold. Because he was originally like, oh, he's going to be off saving the whales. He's going to be doing the heroic things of this world. So I had to sit and think with it a bit. I read it again and I thought for a bit more. And to me, and maybe it's an obvious thing and not a revelation at all, it seems like Erdan is Dogger or Kevin's aspirational self. So when he's writing his book, he's writing this hyper-masculine figure that gets all the women who never say they're washing their hair, and he just sort of kills the hordes with his mighty sword, and he's going through that. But then when Erdan makes it through to his world, he also starts fulfilling his aspirations there too. Like, he's more the kind of guy that Nikki would like. He's more adjusted. He's more good looking. He's all of those things. He's kind of all of the things that Kevin wants to be and never can be, but feels like he's put them into someone else. So that is quite a dark thread throughout that. So the death makes sense to me in that way, because if you want to read it as a sort, because we get a little bit of outside insight into Kevin finally, because it's all sort of his perspective until he disappears literally from the story. And Nikki's saying, oh, it's the drink and the smoking. He doesn't look after himself. And so I hadn't gotten that impression of him as like being so bad. Like, as in, not that smoking and drinking is so bad, but the way that she describes it, it seems like he's actually doesn't take good care of himself either. So actually maybe he's not in a good way.
You're more likely to look after your fictional creation than you are yourself. Shirley Jackson is actually an example of something. She was actually, the reason Shirley Jackson's work have such power is because she was so anxious, such anxious as a person, and had a rather terrible marriage. And it all poured into these terrifying domestic stories where everything goes wrong, like The Haunting of Hill House, and We've Always Lived in the Castle. People who are great artists, I think, often have trouble looking after themselves because they put it all into the creation, whether you're an actor or a writer or a singer.
Or a podcaster.
Well, yes. I can tell by your tormented faces that your life is but dust and ashes, and the only happiness is bringing the word of Terry Pratchett to the world.
Yes, there's a little bit of that. But that's the whole story. But I think, yeah, you're right. There is a sort of a slightly dark undercurrent that runs through it, which gives it a bit more thrill. And maybe that's why he's made Dogger so unlikable. Like, because he's kind of unambiguously unlikable. Although, then again, it was written in 1988. So perhaps Pratchett thought, well, in writing it in 1988, it's for the mainstream audience of a role-playing game magazine. Sadly, at the time, he may have been right in thinking, it's probably a bunch of lads. And they'll think, yeah, like, we don't want to hang out with people eating tofu and stuff. And you're like, they're role players. That's not, we're a bunch of nerds. Come on.
We're very inclusive. We're all nerds. We are all nerds, but are we all Kevin,
I hope not. I mean, it's, yeah, this is the paradox of nerd culture, right? Is that, there's this idea that it's grown out of people who felt like outsiders. And so therefore it should be very inclusive and understanding of anyone who feels like they don't fit in mainstream society. And yet there also has been a consistent thread through it of the same kind of gatekeeping from mostly male participants that you get, like there's always been the equivalent of jocks, but for nerds, And I mean, I was watching the most recent season of Stranger Things, which I won't spoil for anyone if you haven't caught up with it yet, but there's a character introduced right at the start of it who's like the head of the Dungeons and Dragons club at the high school. And he's like that. Like, he treats the younger players the same way a jock who's like the captain of the footy team, like, treats the new players on his team. He's rousting them and telling them what they've got to do, and he's in charge and he's better than them. And he embarrasses them in front of everybody else and picks on them. And I'm like, this is gross. I wouldn't like this if it was a footballer doing it. And I don't like it when it's a nerd Dungeons and Dragons player doing it, It is
human nature to try and gatekeep and try and say, I've got the power and you don't. And in fact, the D&D creation I love most is actually Tripod versus the Dragon, which I don't know you will, yes, but it's just a wonderful celebration of what makes role-playing, the getting together with our friends and hitting things with pointy weapons in our minds. So Tripod versus the Dragon, people, if you I think it's available on DVD if you're outside Australia.
It is. And the soundtrack, it's a musical, so the soundtrack is also available digitally. We'll have a link to that in the episode notes because it is great. I am a big fan also.
It has a beautiful song about how we're all going to be heroes and we're going to pass it on to our children. One day you too will be a hero, which is just tears me up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's beautiful. It really is. Well, look, that's the story. I'd love to read the original, and I think I will try and find it just because I'm interested to know how Pratchett tinkered with it, as he puts it, because it doesn't seem like it would have been radically different when he first wrote it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
One I tried to look up and I couldn't find an answer to. When he's talking about Sherlock Holmes, and he's like, what if he turns up damp from the Richtofen Falls, which is obviously not the actual falls. I tried to find out what
Reichenbach.
Because it's Reichenbach Falls. Yeah, but in this story, he calls them Richtofen.
The Richtofen Falls, yeah.
And I tried to look that up. And all I can get is the Call of Duty character, which is after the time of this. So I was like, what's it referencing?
He might just be he showing how carefully Terry Pratchett did his research. He might have got wrong. Equally, he may be trying to say this character doesn't do his research. Because remember, he also looked up if you could survive off 10,000-year-old frozen mammoth, realised you couldn't, and decided Erdan could anyway. So he might be talking about his casual relationship with research in the real world.
Well, Pratchett was a diligent researcher. I mean, he didn't always use... I think the story about the mammoth is indicative. Like, he would research things and know what the truth was, but sometimes decide to do something else. But I think he's showing there that Dogger is not necessarily a respecter of other fiction.
That's right.
Like, his fantasy fiction is important to him, but he's... not really concerned about remembering the name of the falls in the story. But Richtofen is the name of the Red Baron, Baron von Richtofen. Okay. So I assume that's where he's gotten the name from.
Oh, sorry, from the Richtofen Falls or whatever. Yes, so that's definitely definitely Dogger going, oh, it was some falls.
Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes is actually quite interesting in this context because Conan Doyle actually had to vigorously guard his character. People kept trying to write, the further adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The young Auguste Derleth wrote to him and said, are you going to write any more Sherlock Holmes adventures? And Conan Doyle said no. So Auguste Derleth went off and wrote The Adventures of Solar Pons. There are billions of fictional Victorian detectives out there who were trying to rip off Sherlock Holmes. And of course he famously killed him off and then had to bring him back because of audience pressure.
Yes.
Or because this happened to him.
Yes.
Yes.
Sherlock Holmes turned up, as I say. The one I like most is actually Arsène Lupin, who is a very famous French thief, cat burglar. Anyway, Arsène Lupin had a book where he battled Sherlock Holmes. The French police bring Sherlock Holmes over and he and Arsène have a huge roustabout. And then Conan Doyle's lawyers obviously got in touch with him because every subsequent book he is Herlock Sholmes and his sidekick, Dr. Whitson.
Oh, there's a video game series that does much the same thing. The Phoenix Wright Ace Attorney series, I think it is, has a recurring character who's called Herlock Sholmes in order to get around that. And it's interesting now, like this has come up several times where there's kind of this thing where the earlier version of Sherlock Holmes is now kind of in the public domain, but the later version is not. And when they made the film version of Enola Holmes, the story about Sherlock's much younger sister, they kind of ran afoul of that because in order to get away with making Holmes and not, licensing it from the Conan Doyle estate, you have to use that earlier version who can't be warm or friendly at all. Like he's got to be the really kind of not good with people, I only care about facts version of the character and not the sort of slightly older Sherlock Holmes who maybe gets along with people a little bit better in the stories. So I thought that was quite interesting.
It's how characters take on a life beyond their creator and how problematic that can be, which I think this is also talking to, and even more so now in the world of fan fiction, and which has always existed. It's just now a lot more populous. Yeah. The later Sherlock Holmes stories, I like Mr. Holmes, which I assume they credited the estate because it's Sherlock Holmes retired and keeping bees, but developing Alzheimer's, so his brain is going, and that's a wonderful story. Really great
turned
film.
into a great film as well.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So,
was it Ian McKellen?
Yeah.
Yes, it was.
He is just, whereas Enola Holmes.
Yeah, I thought much the same. It was like, it was okay, I guess. Any other bits of the story we want to pull out?
Oh, there's one thing I wanted to talk about. Again, getting obsessed with the words. Because the place he's from is called Chimera, which is like a thing that is combined from two parts that don't belong together, which kind of is what they are. And I thought that was like a lovely detail.
Sure, yes, it's the lion head and the goat head.
Yeah. And sometimes a dragon as well thrown in there. Yeah, that's interesting. Pratchett rarely chooses these things by accident. Although every now and then people will insist that he's doing a riff on a character, and you'll see comments from back in the day where he's like, no, I'm just doing, like, that's an older archetype. I'm not copying this other thing. It's not a reference. That we're both drawing on this earlier, that sort of stuff. But I think that kind of thing, yeah, for sure. That's intentional.
There's a good line in Upstart Crow where Shakespeare keeps claiming that phrases are his, and his servant has to keep saying, Master, you've got to stop pretending that this phrase is yours. It's been around for generations. Things come around, and of course the art of the artist is actually to put them in a very apt way and put them in a really great context, which that's what the great people do. Upstart Crow being another terrific riff on all kinds of... I should have thought of that because, of course, the characters come out in that. The characters from Shakespeare's plays occasionally. They show the origin stories of the plays in various amusing ways. But there you are.
I don't want to talk about his relationship with Nikki too much because it's just clearly terrible. But he uses a lot of those phrases that kind of are indicative of someone who just accepts that in a relationship it will be kind of awful. And you're like, no. Don't accept that. Like, you should be happy with the person that you're with. There's a classic Pratchett dig at mime artists, which comes back in some of the Discworld books.
They're easy targets.
Yeah.
No, they're not going to speak up about it.
He also says he'd taken The Guardian to keep up with her and got another black mark when he said its children's page read exactly like someone would write if they set out to do a spoof Guardian's children's page. I think I know what you're getting at, but also I've never read the children's page in The Guardian, so I don't exactly get it.
I tried to find one and I couldn't.
I assume it was something that probably existed in the 80s on the print version, but we don't get that in Australia. So I think the also thing is he's just saying he's poking fun at left-wingers and feminists and would probably be poking fun at gay people. But, it's just that's what he does. But I don't actually think it comes... To me, he's actually a very sad figure because he's somebody who doesn't like himself. And so he's not going to be happy. And this poor old Nicky, who actually must have seen something to like in him, he's almost like driving her away because he has a pint of wine and he just can't stop saying nasty things about women in dungarees. It's just like, dude. Yeah. But that is also a very young man, insecure young man thing to do. And in a way, by taking on Erdan and taking on Erdan's quest, he has in fact grown up a bit and will probably not make rude remarks to the Skraelings. Or if he does, they'll think he's some amazing prophet, So hopefully he'll go off and mature and eventually they will meet again in book 25.
Yeah.
I know you guys just don't like him, but I just think it's rooted in that really profound self-loathing, and that might be what Terry Pratchett was thinking about with his character.
Yeah, I think you're right.
It might sound impossible, but I think he's like an unlikable character, as in he's written to be not someone you like, but I feel for him. I don't think he's an irredeemable villain, and I think that I completely agree with you that there's something going on underneath that's causing it. So he's a tragic figure in a lot of ways. So him being not someone who's easy to like doesn't mean that he is written off as a person. So to clarify.
But it means, and I think this is an interesting phrase, written off as a person, because that's what he does. He writes himself out of the...
And I wasn't even trying to do a pun.
Well done. Well done. See, you do them without even meaning to. That's
teamwork.
That's how into it you are. Yeah. Good work. Well, look, we got some great questions for this episode, some of which about the story itself, some of which just some fun things for us to decide based on the story. Liz, do you want to take us through those?
The first one comes from Danny via Twitter. So, which of your characters would you be happy to see turn up on your doorstep, and which would scare the life out of you?
I should point out, we did get a few similar questions to this, but we might touch on some of the others. What do you think, Penny? You've written probably out of all of us the characters that are most like Erdan the Barbarian. Are any of those ones you'd be happy to see turn up on your doorstep?
I tend to write female characters who
But they are fantasy heroes, some of them at least.
Well, they're fantasy and or heroines, I guess. I tend to write fairly fallible characters because they're more interesting. This is a character in a book that I never actually got published. I wanted to show she was a person who wasn't very confident, and then by the end of the book I wanted to show she was confident, so I had her biting her fingernails. Then by the end of the book she was no longer biting her fingernails. This was a subtle sign that she had gained. And I bit my fingernails as an author, and I have stopped, and I gave that to her, and I've never bitten them since. My fingernails are pristine. Mm-hmm. So I'd quite like her to turn up. We could trade fingernail hints. But
what you've just told us, though, Penny, is that you have done in real life a version of what happens in this story.
And a much smaller thing. And I think that's the psychological power of writing in a way, that you can fix wrongs, even if only in your head. But that was it's interesting to me. I wish I could. I need to now create a character who makes $1 million, but becomes extremely wealthy.
Yes.
And see if that works, but I suspect it wouldn't. What about yourselves?
It's hard to describe the kind of fiction that I write. I was trying to think of a good answer. I think in terms of one that I'd be happy to see turn up on my doorstep, there's one character I wrote in a story called The Voyeur, who comes from a family where they have the ability to visit the death days of anyone they're related to. So if you died on the 1st of December, your descendants will be able to go and see you on every 1st December of your life. I can't remember the exact internal logic, but it's something like that. And this woman gets completely obsessed with tracking her mother, who died when she was young, through everyone's death days. So she doesn't live her own life. She ends up living through everyone else's memories, and slowly, like, her own body sort of wastes away, and she doesn't have any experiences of her own because she's just living in the past, quite literally. So I think if she turned up on my doorstep, I'd be quite happy, because I'm like, good, you snapped out of it. You're doing something in the real world. Like, that's progress for you. So I think that would be good character growth for her. So that would make me happy. Which one would scare the life out of you? So this is a spoiler for a story I wrote ages ago, which I doubt anyone is going to read at any point. There's one who shows up on her friend's doorstep and murders her, but gets away with it. It's about, jealousy between friends who've grown up their whole lives, and she knows that this friend has a plan to end her own life on her own terms and has a whole last day planned out of things she wants to do. But because she secretly hates this woman so much, she shows up the day before with a cake that's filled with poison. But because this woman has already set up that she's planning to end her own life, the person who actually murders her gets away with it. So I think I'd be quite scared if that person showed up on my doorstep, because she's one of the worst people I've ever written. So, yeah.
This is turning out to be a very dark episode of the podcast. I do would like to say, if anybody out there is not feeling good about themselves, do not take any of this seriously, and reach out to Lifeline or any other places you might need help with,
Yes. Thank you for saying that.
I should probably put that warning on all of my fiction, in fact.
Yes. Oh, wow. I think, look, it's weird because most of the characters I write for performance, either live performance or recorded, usually audio performance. And a lot of them I play myself. So it's, that's a bit of a weird question, because I feel like I already am them. I do, someone asked specifically about this, in a slightly different way, but I do like Eddie Jones, the character I play in Night Terrace, because he's kind of like me, only younger and dorkier, and with a very different skill set, and a bit more accident prone and a bit sillier. So I like him a lot. I feel like he feels like a younger brother, and if he turned up, I think we'd get along quite well. He'd probably also annoy the shit out of me, but I think it would be okay. So I think it feels a bit cheating, because it's almost like, it's like me. I do like some of the other characters I've written for the show. As for which one would scare the life out of me, I mean, I wrote some pretty awful villains and heroes for the video game that I wrote, Table of Tales, The Crooked Crown. All of the hero characters, they're not heroes. We never refer to them as heroes in the game. We always use the term scoundrels, because that's sort of, it's a little bit, it's sort of closer to neutral, but also suggests they're not necessarily nice people. And I think any of them would scare me, but particularly, there's one of them who she doesn't have a name anymore because she had to give it up as part of a sort of dark magical ritual that gave her powers that also involved like horrible sacrifice and stuff, and opening a portal into another dimension.
The usual.
Anyway, her powers are truly terrifying, and I think she would scare the life out of me for sure. Yeah. So I hope she doesn't show up.
I mean, your answer ties in quite nicely with the next question, which comes from Ian Nichols via Twitter, which is, I guess Ben might not want to swap with Eddie in the time-space continuum of Night Terrace. Is there a character in that series you might want to swap with?
No, I reckon I'd give it a go. I'd like to think I'd get along pretty well with Anastasia, whose house it is, because I'd be quite similar to Eddie, but hopefully less annoying. But also I'd never get to come home again, and that might be scary. So yeah, probably not. I don't know. There are a lot of characters, because it's about a time and space traveling house. They go to a lot of different places. They meet a lot of different people. And some of those places are quite fun. Like there's a whole sort of like steamship in space episode that's kind of like a weird steampunk sci-fi business. I do like that. That's one of the ones I wrote, but I do kind of like that setting because it's sort of a silly take on steampunk where everything's a bit fun. One of the characters has got a hat with cogs on it, but it actually works to like pour tea and stuff. So that could be fun. And I do like Aubrey, the robot from there. I could swap with them. I'd give that a go, but I wouldn't really want to go anywhere. I like it here. How about you two? I mean, you probably haven't heard Night Terrace, but is there a character you would swap with? Because that's a bit of a different prospect to just them turning up here, isn't it?
Who would you recommend for me to swap with, Ben? What do you reckon?
Oh, in Night Terrace,
if we have to do it, yeah, who would you think is a good swap?
Well, I did write a story that was set in like the 1920s. And it's a murder mystery, and the character in it is like a parody of Miss Fisher. But this is a massive spoiler for this episode, but I feel like I have to tell you for this to work out. But as it turns out, the reason she can solve all these crimes is that she's done them herself, and she's done the research into who she can successfully frame for them. So, that you might have fun swapping with her before she's found out, because then you could take over her. You could become the detective in much the same way as you were talking about people writing more Sherlock Holmes. You could become the new Miss Leona Baker, and go on to solve a lot of crimes. So that could be fun.
I love that. Yeah, no, I'm completely sold.
Well,
Yeah.
that's Agatha Christie, isn't it? Why didn't they ask Evans, you know? I do like the idea of, yes, you're an excellent detective because you've done the murders. I think that really works for me.
Yeah.
I think in one of the Jasper Fforde books, there's a thing about how Miss Marple is the murderer, and that's how she solves all of the St. Mary because she wants to stay relevant. So
I was thinking of Jasper Fforde, but I've only read The Air Affair. But rather than novel characters coming to our world, you're going to their world, but you've got to stay below the surface of the novel in order to succeed, which is a lovely conceit.
Well, I think you'd like his other books. There's a lot of fun in there.
There's so much time in the world, and one day I will get to every book in it, but actually I won't. But
Yeah, there's
I like that as a goal.
not enough time.
Yeah, it was great.
Terry Pratchett said of him, he blurbed him one time, and it was, "I will watch Jasper Fforde nervously," which I think is an excellent blurb.
That is a good blurb.
that means I will backstab him behind his back so he never gets as successful as me. So miming a dagger being plunged into Jasper Ford's back by Erdan the Barbarian. Actually, Erdan would never plunge a dagger into your back, would he? Plunge it into your front.
No, he'd fight you face to face.
That's right. Yes,
Well,
that's right.
maybe. Or is he the kind of barbarian hero who's like, look, it's a fight, like, as many of Pratchett's characters say, if it's a fight to the death, there's no rules. So,
But he'd start at the front. Unless
yeah,
you
I
were
think that's fair.
the she-dragon of the snow steppes or whatever, you know, in which case all bets are off.
Yeah. But I don't think he's not like, he wouldn't sneak up on you.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'll try for honourable, but if he can't do it, he'll try for winning.
I think barbarians are a pragmatic people.
Yes.
This actually leads very nicely into the next question as well, which is from Steve Leahy via Twitter. Did Skung stay behind the sofa, getting dustier and hungrier, or was it hung on the wall in the study alongside a stuffed carp caught in Scotland?
I was thinking about this because my feeling was if Erdan is transformed into someone who would fit into the real world, I feel like maybe Skung has as well. And when he digs down into the sofa, he doesn't find the sword. He finds like a big paper knife like, that goes in a jar at the, on the desk for opening letters. You know?
I thought he might transform into a pen with which he can write witty remarks to sign the books for his fans,
Very good.
Well, he can spill the blood, that takes for writing stories.
That's right, ink instead of blood. The pen is mightier than the sword, unless you've actually holding a sword and the other person's trying to fight with a pen, in which case that is not true.
Although I do also like the idea that he is still there, not behind the sofa, but maybe lost down the cushion and people are never comfortable sitting on that couch and they don't know why.
Or why there's a voice saying, I want to drink your blood coming from behind them. The next question is from Discworld Monthly via Twitter, which just asked, have you seen the short film of it? And then there's a link, which you can put in the show notes. My answer is no.
No.
Yeah, I was hoping to get a chance to watch it before we did this episode, and I did not. But it is one of a small handful of fan films based on Pratchett's work, and this one's actually filmed in Czech, is the language that it's in, but there are English subtitles. And I have seen a couple of stills from it. It looks pretty good. Like it's a fan film. It's an interesting story to pick, but I guess if you've got someone who can convincingly play Erdan the Barbarian.
It's sci-fi props are low. I mean, if you're looking at a budget, it's a good one.
Yeah. And this is why urban fantasy is so popular for TV, right? It's very cheap to make compared to high fantasy. Yeah. I have since watched the film Poslední odměna, and it's good. It was written and directed by Ladislav Pratchett in 2013, who's made a really lovely adaptation that keeps a lot of the original story's jokes and lines while making it all feel a bit more real and modern. For example, Dogger's relationship with Nikki has deteriorated not just because of his rude truthfulness, but because he's become obsessed with his books and their success and neglected her for 2 years in some pretty major ways. And Dogger's also shown to be very successful. He lives in a fancy 2-story house surrounded by countryside, has a hugely successful book launch with a packed fan signing and a live TV interview, and after that his agent, who drives a sports car, takes him out for a drug and booze-filled celebration at a nightclub. Erdan is a bit more Geralt of Rivia than Conan the Barbarian and dies in an alternate version of his final battle with a group of soldiers rather than under a snowdrift. The cast are all great and there's a lovely chemistry between Marco Igonda as Erdan and Jarek Heibrandt as Dogger. Erdan himself comes across as a well-meaning doofus of a hero, especially in a scene where he's laughing in joy at a play before interrupting it to save the leading lady. Erdan's evolution is much more subtle. His transformation is shown as a short scene at the end of a trying-on clothes montage, and so is Dogger's fate. But it's clear the filmmakers had a lot of fun and put a lot of love into it, and it's well worth 36 minutes of your time. Yes, it's not that short of a short film. Check it out.
So the next question comes from the IU via Twitter. Which of Terry's characters, Discworld or otherwise, would you think would have had the most interesting time if they entered our world? How would Vimes or Rincewind, Granny, the Patrician, Moist, etc. fare?
This is a good question, isn't it? I mean, the later the books get, the more like our world the Discworld becomes, in some ways. Although it's always a bit like our world. I feel like the Patrician would just slide right in. No problems. Rincewind would love it because there's no monsters trying to eat him all the time. And people would value his skill with languages and wouldn't care that he can't do any magic because there isn't any. And when you think about Rincewind in the very first couple of books, he's the character, and later on this sort of torch passes to Ponder Stibbons, but he's the character who wishes that the world made a bit more logical sense rather than ran on magic. So again, I think, if that aspect of his personality is still there somewhere, he would love being in our real world. So I think those two at least would do great.
I love watching Nanny do tourism, so I feel like Nanny Og in our world, just marveling at everything or criticizing everything would be interesting for me, certainly. Probably interesting for Granny, who would be dragged along no matter what.
Yes. Moist von Lipwig would do great in our world. There's no shortage of opportunities for an enterprising ex-con man. So I think a lot of them would do just fine. Penny, I know you haven't read a lot of Pratchett, but do you recall any of the characters from his stories that you think might do all right?
Well, what I enjoy, I've forgotten the name of the postman. I think he'd do.
That's moist for Lipwig.
Thank you. He would love to come in and see a well-run post office, though who knows. The Death. I think the character of Death is a good one, and he would certainly is already in both worlds. So you know,
I think he'd see it. Yeah, he'd see a real opportunity to do some good here. I guess he would be sort of like, let's make things easier and nicer at that end. Yeah.
But yes, the other than that, my favourite one is actually Good Omens, which is they're already here.
They kind of are, aren't
and they are having an interesting time.
That's right.
Yes, they are.
Off to that little pub in Jerusalem.
Oh, yeah.
And I did love the recent TV series. I thought that was a wonderful adaptation. And
They're making more, aren't they?
Yes, season 2 coming out later this year based on an idea that Terry and Neil had for a sequel that they didn't end up writing. So
yeah, and Neil gets to direct it this time, and thus, you know, he'll be happy. He won't have to be reverential to Neil's bits.
Yes.
So I do remember reading the introduction to Good Omens, and they talked about how they used to fax each other the things they'd done overnight. And I just went, fax. The young people won't know what they're talking about.
They used to mail floppy disks through the post as well.
I was actually at Telstra store the other day and I needed a form sent and I wanted to see if it was possible to fax it because I know some places still have it. And I was on the phone to the person and I was like, oh, maybe, do you still have a fax machine? And the woman at Telstra store was like, meaning they don't have one. I was like, okay, all right.
When I worked at the Medical Practitioners Board of Victoria, the standard for communicating between the medical boards of the various states was still faxing things. And that was not that, that was like a decade ago. That was not that long ago. It is no longer the case, I can confirm.
So our next question came from lovely Rose via Twitter. Just to say, Rose sent us a brilliant question, but it definitely involves a spoiler for a certain book that we don't want to spoil. So we'll refrain from answering it for now, but we just want to say thank you, Rose.
Yes, and don't look that question up on Twitter if you don't want to get spoiled either. It is subtle, and I know you didn't mean it, Rose, but we know that a lot of people listening to the show do not want to get spoiled for that book. Even though you didn't mention which one it was, people can probably guess, so don't look it up.
But we appreciate you asking.
Yes, it was a great question. I will try and remember it for when we get up to that book, because I want to answer the question.
All right, so Belle has asked via Discord some questions that we've covered the ground on already, but which of Pratchett's non-Discord characters would you most like to have stay with you?
Oh. Would you like anyone from Good Omens to come and stay with you, Penny?
I just think they're followed by chaos and disaster. So you just open the door, have them run through, then open the back door, they can go out in the backyard.
You just bet their escape and you don't want to get any further involved in that.
That's right. Before they start wrecking the furniture.
That's great.
I did like that order of nuns. I thought the evil nuns were lovely and they could come around any time and have a cup of tea.
Oh, what is it? The Chattering Order of Beryl.
That's right, yes. Like they had to keep talking.
Yes. They'd be good value. You get a lot of good conversation out of them.
That's right. And then again, you show them the door.
This is a good question. The books that I love, the non-Discord ones the most, they're not characters I necessarily want to come and stay with me. I know because I don't like them, but because it would just be sort of weird. Because I like a lot of his like children characters and I'm like, that's not, I don't need them to come and stay with me. I can come and do one of my workshops. That'd be cool. Hang out for a bit. I do like the gnomes, so I think I would love to hang out with some of them. Maybe Masklin and Grimmer, but maybe more so like Angelo and Gerda. In fact, if Gerda's still traveling the world trying to find other gnomes, if you haven't read those books or listened to our episodes, this is like a race of tiny people who are, very, very small, who live in the cracks of the human world. I would love, Gerda could come and say hi. I could help him on his journey. He could stay here for a while. He'd be safe. What about you, Liz?
Well, I mean, the unadulterated cat pretty much already lives in my house. We've got some of those characters, but
likewise.
I think I don't want anyone in my house, but if I was going to choose someone from a non-Discord book, perhaps for purely like curiosity reasons, I'd be interested in having the ghosts or the dead from Johnny and the Dead come to stay because they're from different eras. They've got interesting stories to tell, and I feel like that would be just a great opportunity to learn about different eras from first-hand experience. So I would quite enjoy that, I think. So hang out with a few ghosts in the spare room.
That could be fun.
Final questions come from Sven via Discord. What would your role-playing game character say to your living situation? Not judging.
I like this idea because it does feel like, a lot of us won't have written the sort of fantasy character that Erdan represents But we have played role-playing games and we've made a character like this, whether in a pen and paper game on the tabletop or in a video game. If they turned up, what would they think about it? Would they be impressed with the fridge or what? It's tricky when you've had a lot of characters. Penny, you've probably had dozens, if not hundreds of different characters over the years.
Talking about the ones I've played most recently, this is a terrible idea, people, don't do it. Because we had to play role-playing games by Zoom during the lockdown, Mark took us through Curse of Strahd, which is a very dark, vampiric role-playing game.
Yes, it is. My partner was running me through that as well, actually.
Not a good idea. But so very shortly on, I'm going to use a rude word here, very shortly on, my character started calling Strahd arsehole Strahd, and then the whole thing went downhill very quickly. But it was, I think, because she was trapped in a horrible, dark, gothic world and you couldn't escape, and this stupid vampire overlord kept taunting you. She'd turn up at our place and go, oh, thank goodness. Running water.
Yeah.
Where's the garlic?
She'd be fortifying it.
That's right. Storekeepers who like taking your money, and the prices aren't grossly inflated, though in fact, obviously toilet paper would have been difficult. Yes, so that's it. But then, of course, the other characters tend to be in the 1920s, because that's Call of Cthulhu. I think they'd be a bit worried they were trapped in some MyGo hell, but there you are. Brain in a metal canister gone to Mars. Because what's the line? Science is magic. Somebody who doesn't understand science would see it as magic. So
yes. Sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. We've talked about this before on the podcast because it come up in Science and Discworld books. But yes, I get what you mean.
That's right.
I keep thinking the last, not because I'm running games more these days than I'm playing, but the last Dungeons and Dragons game that I played a very anxious sorcerer who wasn't entirely in control of his powers and was very worried that they might go off and incinerate people. And I think if he came here, I think he'd feel quite comfortable because he's always worried when he got these powers through this sort of magical storm kind of thing, he got sucked into another world and he can't ever go home. And so I think if he got here, he'd at least feel like he was safe because it's like a stable, reasonably sedate kind of world for the most part. I mean, obviously there's some things going wrong, but there's no, dragons coming to eat him or weird creatures. There's none of that. So I think he'd be okay with that. Well, as to what he'd think of my living situation, look, I think he'd be all right with it.
There is a line that if we went back in time, even 150 years ago, we would die because the world is full of microbes against which we have no defense. We would die very shortly. And there are horrible ways to die in historical reality that we don't have now. And that most fantasy worlds, you might have some killer plague wandering around, but you won't have dysentery and cholera. And, the more gritty and realistic worlds you will, but we're not really.
Yeah, it's that idea of magical medieval Europe, right? It's like medieval Europe, but with all of the really nasty parts filed off. Yeah.
Even Melbourne, where I live in the gold rush, had a cesspool in Little Collins Street so large that, it was basically a 60-foot wide, 6-foot deep pool of, I'm going to say, filth.
Is that where they held music festivals?
Probably, yes. Splendor in the Glass.
Oh, no.
We airbrush that out of history, but that's why we enjoy fantasy. And we also forgot to remember the reason they invented penicillin was because people would die of infections. And the bloke that they first tried it on was dying of an infection that he got when he was pruning his roses and he pricked his finger. And that became an unstoppable infection. And he was dying when he took on this dangerous radical cure. And they cured him, but they couldn't refine enough penicillin. They would actually get his urine and race it back to the lab and refine it to get the penicillin out and then rush it back and re-inject it into him. They called it the pea patrol. They were doing it on bicycles. So wow. It's not modern science, but it worked. Amazing. But unfortunately, he died anyway. He relapsed and died because they couldn't get enough penicillin into him with the very primitive apparatus that they had. We forget that was in the 1940s, 1950s.
I've never heard that part of the story. That's amazing.
Same.
Look it up, people.
I will look it up. That's amazing.
I'm writing it down right now.
Here's to the brave men and women.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't have a great answer for the role-playing game character because I feel terrible confessing this to you both. I haven't played a role-playing game in years. I did when I first moved to Melbourne, and I had a friend who very kindly set up a one-day Dungeons and Dragons game for us where she was a dungeon master and she wrote characters out all for us in advance so that we could play through it. And I don't remember anything about my character at all. What I do remember, and Ben has possibly heard this story before, is that another friend of mine was assigned a character who, as just a bit of like color, was assigned that their character loved to loom things. And for some reason, we all latched onto this idea that her character could loom. So we would get to a chasm or something. We're like, Sean, can you quickly like loom us a bridge? And our dungeon master was like, it's not one of her, would have to sit here in real time while she looms a bridge. And so I wonder if that character who could loom things came to our world. I feel like she'd have a nice time because she'd be able to loom things on her own terms and wouldn't be asked to do ridiculous looming like a bridge. So yeah, I think that she would be quite happy.
Yeah. She could sit down and get her Bayeux tapestry on is what, that would be good.
Yeah.
Exactly.
When you said loom, I literally thought you meant somebody who would blow this. That was a visual gag, everybody.
That's very rational.
Yes, somebody would come and just stand over you, so you could just imagine some gnome was interacting with you and she'd just walk and stand over them.
I mean, that would be amazing too. So our final question from Sven is, bonus question, if you were to imagine having a best-selling book series, A, which genre, B, what main protagonist, and C, what mode of death of said main protagonists?
Oh, wow.
I feel like if I knew this, I would have a best-selling book series.
It's more fun to imagine, I expect, if you're not a writer.
No, I've got it all down pat, but you guys first.
Oh, yep.
Oh. Well, mine would be definitely a comedy series of some description, and I think I would probably like to try... I've been thinking about this a bit recently. I like the idea of like a magical post-apocalypse. I don't know if this is the one that I would want to be a best-selling series, but I think that could be fun because if it's magical, it can be an allegory for things in the real world, but has quite a distance from them. But also, you can have all this weird stuff happening a little bit, like what's that role-playing game? Gamma World, like that kind of level of weirdness or Fallout, but with magical stuff happening. And you could meet all these different characters. So that would be the genre. I've been thinking about doing this as in another medium, and the main character I imagined was a wizard who didn't cause the apocalypse, but had something to do with it, so feels guilty, and he's sort of roaming the earth trying to help people where he can. But he's a little bit rince-windy. He's not necessarily the greatest wizard, but he can actually do magic. So that's probably one of the protagonists, and then he'd have like a crew that go with him. I don't know who they'd be. How would he die at the end? Maybe he'd die by reversing the magical apocalypse, and then he would like sort of explode. I don't know. That sounds like a fun ending. It would have to be a funny. I mean, this is, as we've discussed in this episode, it's difficult to do a funny death that's okay. But in a fantasy world, you can kind of get away with it, right? Because you don't have to obey the normal rules of physics, and we know that there's not the same kind of ramifications. Although in a novel, you do kind of get into the characters' heads and know them quite well. So it's a kind of a medium where it's difficult to kill characters off and not feel bad about it. So I guess you would feel bad. But yeah, you probably die in some sort of spectacular magical explosion, I reckon. That's my imaginary novel series.
All right. Well, I'm keen to read it when you write it. But
it probably won't be novels.
For me, I guess... I'm not sure. I'm just going to go with what I would absolutely love to read and think I would enjoy writing. I love reading crime, but not like hardcore gritty crime where you sit around drinking a whiskey and are angry and your wife has left you. Not that kind of crime. So like cozy more crime? Like Agatha Christie, cozy crime. But maybe with a time-traveling protagonist so you can solve crimes from different eras because that could be quite fun. Mode of death? I don't know. For this one, it could be old age because they could just like time travel until like they're a Miss Marple and then eventually like close their last case and then they're done. I think that would, because it's cozy crime. I know Agatha Christie hasn't given a nice death to all of her main characters, but I think in this one I would like it to be nice. Just they ran out their career on a high and then die of old age, having solved a lot of crimes across time, and they've gone back to their favorite era to live out their days. Very nice.
I think it's very difficult to kill off the protagonist of your best-selling series because, as Conan Doyle and Kevin Dogger have discovered,
yes,
there is no good way to do it.
No.
Like yourself, I'm a real big proponent of cozy crime. Amelia Peabody is, of course, my go-to 1920s Egyptologist who solves crime and raps the bad guys on the knuckles with her umbrella. My other favourite fictional detective is Judge D, who is a Dutch diplomat in China, read the Chinese detective novels of the Han and Tang period and decided he loved them, but there was too much magic shit in them. Gods kept turning up and animals could talk. So he invented Judge D, the righteous Confucius judge, he strokes his beard, looks at you thoughtfully, has a cup of tea, and then goes out and solves the crime with his gang of they're called the heroes of the Greenwood, the kind of Robin Hood, the outlaws of the marsh. So if I could get some kind of cross, I think that'd be wonderful. But really, I'd probably want a 1920s protagonist who's a detective who fights, unfortunately, Cthulhu and all his minions, and there is no good way to end that. That is madness and death, unfortunately. But what I'd probably do is kill off all the companions so that she dies mad. I mean, but, she's in the ultimate Lovecraftian ending is that the narrator starts saying, I wish I hadn't seen all this stuff. I'm going mad or they're going to get me. So I think that's how you'd finish it. She's not dead, but she knows it's only a matter of time and she hopes to die before, they come and get her. However, the only actual comedy I know that has managed to carry off death is actually The Good Place, which of course starts after everybody's already dead, thus solving all those knotty plot issues around,
And they all die in kind of ridiculous ways as well.
That's right. But hard to put in fiction to an outraged fan. There's a lovely, I don't know, you probably haven't seen it. There's a lovely Edwardian cartoon of a small boy sitting in bed reading his Sherlock Holmes short stories, and it's titled The Death of Sherlock Holmes. And the small boy's just sitting there going, visual joke, everybody. It's the face of a little boy who just sees his hero plunge to his death. It's
pretty intense.
You can't, even if it's a fictional character, if you love that character, it is so hard. And it's probably why we're better not to kill them off, frankly.
Yeah, I don't think any of my favourite characters have been killed off. Well, unless you count the Doctor, who is about to die for, I think, at least the 14th time.
And would you be devastated if they were?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you kind of want... It's interesting because the story doesn't have to end until you choose it to, which makes it a bit of a quandary. But, it's interesting.
I think we like to think that our favourite characters are still living somewhere in our heads, that they're off. Mr. Darcy and Miss Bennet are off and Moist is off, they're all off there still doing their thing, even if they're doing it is over and over, and that's why it's so hard.
Actually, and that's my question actually about Kevin, the bard singer. Do we think his stories are a hit? Do you think he goes on a lot of adventures?
I think Erdan is successful at everything he does.
Yeah.
So yes, I think...
Yeah. Trucks of cash.
I don't think he'll be staying in that semi-detached for long. Except he's got to go and hang off the end of a whaling ship, obviously, but he can do that and then write the novels in his spare time.
Yeah. Do you think he's going to make... this is the other thing I was wondering is Kevin going to become a better person as this hero? Like, if Erdan's writing the books, he's clearly not going to write them in the vein of the books he was in. He's going to write them in a bit more of a right on, let's do the right thing kind of frame. So is it Kevin going to become this kind of like environmental fantasy hero?
Well, his better half influencing him rather than the other way around. So maybe that is like progress for him.
Yeah. The scales have gone the other way. I kind of like that idea.
Yeah, it's also the idea of what is a character. A lot of successful literary creations are in some way the ego, the superego. Like Holmes and Watson, I'm using that example. It's the ego and the superego. It's like these creations, and Conan Doyle is kind of, they're a trio. They're parts of our personality that we splinter off into our creations. So I do think, if a better person is writing the book, then the character will be better too. So. And in a way, that's forecasting fan fiction. You're writing on the creation of a shared world, which is key to things like role-playing, and also actually the Lovecraft mythos, bless it. Lovecraft's one of the first writers who quite willingly shared his world and said other people could build on it.
Yeah.
Perhaps by sharing that world, it would become even more realistic. And one day, in fact, Tolkien believed this. He believed that in some way, if you write something realistically enough, it becomes real. So that's why he invented the languages, and also because he was a linguist and he loved that kind of stuff. And he used to get awfully annoyed at C.S. Lewis, who would just throw all aspects of mythology in. Centaurs, sure, everything can go in there. Christianity, put it all in. And that's it's that argument that if you believe something and create it intensely enough and completely enough, then it is real.
There's that great meme, I think maybe that goes around. It's like J.R.R. Tolkien don't ask me if this is about World War II. It's what you want it to be about. And then C.S. Lewis, if you don't understand that Aslan is Jesus, I will go absolutely insane.
There's a great series of little video sketches by a comedian named Eleanor Morton who does these little vignettes where she's playing both C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien, and they're arguing about various things. There's one of the best ones I saw recently was that Tolkien bets C.S. Lewis he can come up with a stupider character name than C.S. Lewis can, and they go back and forth. It's very funny. We'll have to chuck a link to those in the episode notes. She's very good. And she's been on an episode of Desert Island Discworld as well, so you can listen to her talking about Pratchett if you want. I'll stick that in the episode notes as well. But I think that kind of brings us to the end of this discussion. Penny, thank you so much for coming back and talking to us again. We had such a good time last time. We absolutely wanted to have you back again. What's in the pipeline for you that's coming out next?
Well, I've got something coming out, but who knows when, thanks to delays and so on. But we have been working on a Call of Cthulhu Gaslight campaign, which it is currently being edited, and hopefully it will come out shortly. And, well, not shortly.
No.
Possibly next year. At some point.
Yeah. In good time.
In good time. So, yeah, I was able to put a lot of my love for all these wonderful Edwardian ghost stories into that, and worked with a team of scenario writers who just each took a different idea from a different writer and ran with it. The guy who took the Benson brothers just came up with a beautiful, the most horrific house in the most horrific Edwardian version of London that you could possibly imagine. So I think it'll be great when it comes out.
Okay, that sounds amazing. Are you allowed to say what it's called so people know what to look out for?
We had a working name, and I just don't think I better say anything because it's
sure.
I don't know what name they're actually going to call it.
We'll watch out for a new collection. Or is it a single campaign, or is it a collection?
It's a campaign,
sort of smaller?
but they've also got to get out the reissue, the Gaslight source book,
which is for Victorian England.
Yes,
in the Cthulhu mythos.
Yes, so that's why we call it Gaslight. It's like a horrific version of Victorian London with the mythos at ever ready to reach out a tentacle and yank you into the darkness.
Sounds fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about this story, Final Reward. We're recording this all a bit out of order this time of year. It's just been a weird kind of time for scheduling, so I'm a bit all over the place. But we are going to be coming back next month where we'll be talking about, Liz, the third in a series of books we've been talking about. It's the Science of Discord 3,
Darwin to Watch.
Yeah, which it should be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it. If you've got questions about that, please send them in. The hashtag for that book, if you're sending questions on social media, is Pratchett59. If you are emailing them to us, you can email them to us at chat@pratchettpodcast.com. And while you're thinking of questions, the episode after that, our 60th episode, if you'll believe such a thing is possible, we are doing another kind of general questions episode. We did this for episode 30. We're doing it again for episode 60. So if you have any Pratchett question that you want to ask us, if there's something you'd like to hear us talk about, whether that's just a general question about his work, a question about something we haven't covered, a question about a book we have talked about previously, but you didn't get to send in the question back then, questions about where to start with the books, although that is something that we covered in our previous episode, so maybe listen to that first. But if you've got any questions like that, now's your chance. We'll take whatever questions you want. And if you've got questions you want to ask us just about our work and stuff that we do that's not even Pratchett related, we'll probably answer those as well. So send them on in. We'd love to hear them. And I think, look, I'm going to ask a couple of questions of you. What would you like us to be talking about on this podcast that we have not yet talked about? Is there something you want us to do? We've had lots of ideas, things like, should we do episodes about other authors that you might enjoy? Should we do episodes about genre conventions or things that are clearly influences on Pratchett? Is there something you want us to be doing that we aren't currently doing? Let us know. We would love to know that. Liz, did you have any questions you want to specifically ask?
I'd actually be quite curious, like, what people's favorite episodes that we've done are and why. Like, what stands out about them so that we can keep doing it.
That's a good one. So send us in your questions, send us in your answers, and we will give the appropriate questions or answers to them. That's a terrible way to describe that. But anyway, we will use them for episode 60. Pratchett 60 is the hashtag to use for that if you're going to send those questions via social media. But thank you. Thank you so much. And until next time, please be careful what you write. You've been listening to Pratchett, the monthly Terry Pratchett Book Club podcast with Pratchetters Elizabeth Flux, Ben McKenzie, that's me, and guest Penelope Love. Pratchett is produced and edited by me, with music by David Ashton of Sample and Hold Studios. You can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Pratchett Podcast, and listen to past episodes and support the production of new ones via pratchettpodcast.com. Join the conversation for this episode using the hashtag Pratchett58.
Pratchett is brought to you by Splendid Chaps Productions. We make entertainment for your ears, like the Doctor Who podcast Splendid Chaps and time travel comedy series Night Terrors. To find out more, visit splendidchaps.com.